What would you do if the man you planned to spend the rest of your life with sent you a commanding text, "I'm on a work trip, don't call, I'll explain later," only for you to discover that his business trip was actually a steamy getaway with another woman? My name is Patricia. I'm 36 years old. I've spent my entire youth building a career as a high-stakes real estate broker, believing I had finally found a safe harbor in my fiancé. But as it turned out in his eyes, I wasn't a bride-to-be, I was just a convenient pit stop. He didn't just betray my heart. He was secretly stealing my biggest multi-million-dollar contracts to use as a welcome gift for a rival firm. He wanted my silence fine. I gave him the most terrifying silence of his life. While he was lost in the arms of his mistress, I was quietly auditing his entire existence. I didn't scream and I didn't waste a single tear. Instead, I did the one thing that would hurt him most. I stripped him of the things he craved above all else, his reputation and his career. In a single afternoon, I ensured he was fired without a cent of severance. And that very night at a family dinner where our parents were eagerly discussing wedding plans, I forced him to his knees literally as his disgusting truth was stripped bare. In that moment, as his face went deathly pale and the blood drained from his cheeks, I realized one thing: traitors don't fear tears. They fear the intelligence of a woman who has nothing left to lose. Do not miss a single second of this story. The way I made him vanish from high society and forced him to pay back every last cent of his social credit will leave you deeply satisfied. This is a warning to anyone who dares to underestimate the silence of a woman. My name is Patricia, a 36-year-old high-end real estate broker who has spent over a decade navigating the shark-infested waters of the American luxury market. In my world, a house is never just a house. It is a complex web of contracts, inspections, and the unspoken motives of people who have too much money and too little time. I have made my career by reading between the lines of a legal clause and identifying the exact moment a buyer is bluffing. I live by the data, the fine print, and the concrete reality of a solid foundation. My life was a masterpiece of curation, a perfectly staged home where every piece of furniture was in its right place, and every window was polished to a shine. For 5 years, my fiancé Mark was the centerpiece of that staged life. He was an ambitious corporate consultant, a man who spoke the language of growth and ROI with a fluency that matched my own. Our relationship wasn't built on the volatile, fleeting sparks of a teenage romance. It was a safe investment. We were two high achievers who had surveyed the market and decided that we were each other's best possible assets. To me, Mark represented stability, a partner who understood that a successful life required discipline, routine, and a shared vision for the future. We had a 5-year plan, a joint calendar, and a wedding set for the autumn that promised to be the social event of our professional circle. I trusted the structure we had built. I trusted the contract of our commitment. The first crack in the foundation didn't appear as a loud crashing sound. It was a soft digital ping on a Tuesday afternoon while I was closing a $3 million escrow on a penthouse overlooking the city. I picked up my phone expecting a logistical update about our dinner reservations. Instead, I saw a text that felt like a cold draft entering a locked room. "I'm on a work trip. Don't call. I'll explain later." I sat in my leather office chair, the scent of expensive perfume and old paper surrounding me, and I read those 11 words over and over. A younger, more insecure version of myself might have immediately spiraled into a panic about where he was or who he was with. But my mind doesn't work in shadows. It works in logic. I didn't focus on the trip. I focused on the command. Don't call. In the world of professional negotiation, the tone of a message is often more important than the content. Mark hadn't sent a request for privacy. He had issued a directive for my disappearance. It was a command tone, the kind used by a superior to a subordinate or a landlord to a tenant. In that single sentence, Mark had shifted the dynamic of our entire 5-year partnership. He wasn't asking for my support while he handled a crisis. He was telling me to be silent until he found it convenient to speak to me again. I felt a strange, clinical detachment wash over me. I realized that in Mark's eyes, I wasn't a partner of equal standing. I was a premium amenity, a luxury feature of his life that he believed he could simply switch off when his focus was required elsewhere. He viewed my presence as a convenience, something that was supposed to be there when he wanted it, and invisible when he didn't. To a man who respects his partner, their voice is a comfort in a storm. To Mark, my voice was a distraction he had no intention of managing. Most women would have called anyway. They would have demanded an explanation, sent a flurry of angry messages, or called his office to verify his whereabouts. But I have spent years winning at the closing table by knowing exactly when to stay quiet. Silence is a powerful tool. It creates a vacuum that the other person eventually feels compelled to fill. I decided right then to apply my due diligence mindset to my own relationship. If Mark wanted me to be silent, I would give him exactly what he asked for, but not for the reasons he thought. I didn't reply. I didn't even send a thumbs-up emoji to acknowledge the receipt. I simply put my phone face down on the desk. This was the moment I began the conscious process of withdrawing my equity from our life together. In real estate, when you realize a property is a bad investment, you don't keep pouring money into the renovations. You start looking for the exit. I stepped back, emotionally moving from the role of the devoted fiancé to the role of a neutral third-party observer. I started to look at Mark not as the man I loved, but as a case study in human behavior. I spent the rest of the evening in my quiet apartment watching the sunset paint the walls in shades of amber and gold. I didn't feel the urge to check my phone or see if he had followed up. I realized that the true character of a person is revealed not in how they act when you are watching, but in how they treat you when they think you have no power to respond. Mark thought he was managing me, keeping me on a shelf until he was ready to play his next hand. He didn't realize that by asking for my silence, he had given me the clarity I needed to see him for exactly what he was, a liability I could no longer afford to carry. I went to bed early that night, sleeping with a strange, heavy calmness. I woke up the next morning and went about my routine. I showed 2 properties, attended a marketing meeting, and had lunch with a regular client. Not once did I reach out to him. I was waiting to see how long it would take for him to notice that the woman he thought he owned had stopped responding. I was waiting to see if he would realize that silence isn't just the absence of sound. It is the presence of an ending. When the second day passed, and then the third, and my phone remained empty of any follow-up or concern from him, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He wasn't worried about me. He wasn't checking in to see if I was okay with his sudden disappearance. He was so confident in my compliance, so certain that I would be right where he left me, that he didn't even feel the need to maintain the facade. When he didn't notice my silence, I realized I hadn't been a partner. I had been an option he thought he'd already bought. The 4th day of Mark's silence didn't bring a phone call, but it did bring a notification that served as the final death knell for my trust. As a high-level broker, I maintained several shared business accounts for tax purposes and joint investment ventures we had established to build our empire. A ping from our shared travel expense app caught my eye. Mark, usually meticulous about covering his tracks, had made a rookie mistake. He had used our primary business credit card to settle a resort fee at the Azure Palms in Cabo San Lucas. I stared at the digital receipt, my thumb hovering over the screen. He wasn't at a mid-market convention center in Chicago. He was in a $1,000-a-night oceanfront suite. I felt the familiar chill of an adrenaline spike, the same one I get when I realize a seller is hiding a structural defect in a basement. I didn't cry. My first instinct wasn't to mourn the man, it was to audit the damage. I opened my laptop and began to pull the threads. It didn't take long to find the social media tag from a junior associate at a rival real estate firm. There he was in the background of a sun-drenched photo holding a glass of vintage champagne. Next to him was a woman half my age, but she wasn't the focal point of my anger. Standing on his other side was the managing director of Vanguard Properties, my primary competitor. The weight of the betrayal shifted in my chest from a romantic hurt to a cold professional fury. This wasn't just a clandestine getaway with a mistress. This was a celebration. I knew Vanguard's hiring cycle. They had been trying to break into my exclusive zip codes for years, but they lacked the entry point. As I dug deeper into our shared cloud drive, the full scope of his predatory plan came into focus. Mark hadn't just been unfaithful, He had been a Trojan horse in my own home. I found a hidden subfolder in our wedding planning drive that contained something that made my blood turn to ice. It was my golden Rolodex, the confidential hard-earned list of my top-tier clients, their private contact details, and the historical data of every transaction I had closed in the last decade. He had spent months meticulously exporting my professional life. He was using my reputation, my social capital, and my intellectual property as his buy-in for a high-level executive position at Vanguard. He wasn't just leaving me. He was planning to cannibalize my career to build his own throne at a rival firm. He had calculated that by the time I discovered the affair and the wedding was called off, he would already be settled into his new office armed with my secrets, leaving me to deal with the social humiliation and a gutted business. My analytical mind, the one that has seen me through 100 hostile negotiations, took over. I realized that if I confronted him now, I would be the scorned woman, and he would have the chance to delete the evidence, play the victim, or move even faster to consolidate his theft. In the luxury market, once a deal is in jeopardy, you don't reveal your hand, you secure your assets. I opened a new encrypted digital drive on my personal server and titled it Exit. So, it was time to treat this relationship like a complex multi-million-dollar foreclosure. I began by mapping out every joint asset we held, from the vacation home in Aspen to our shared investment portfolio. I pulled the prenuptial agreement we had drafted months ago, reading the bad faith and moral turpitude clauses with a surgeon's precision. I started a meticulous log of his fraud, taking screenshots of the credit card statements, the resort bookings, and most importantly, the digital footprint of his unauthorized access to my proprietary client data. I worked through the night, fueled by a clarity that was sharper than any grief. I looked at the photos of us on my desk, the curated images of a power couple, and saw them for what they were: marketing material for a scam. I realized that Mark's greatest weakness was his own arrogance. He believed I was too safe, too predictable, and too invested in the image of our perfect life to ever burn it down. He thought he could walk away with the prize and leave me holding the empty bag of our broken engagement. But I have spent my life understanding that every contract has a loophole, and every thief leaves a trail. I began to strategize not just for a breakup, but for a total professional liquidation. I needed him to stay in Cabo. I needed him to feel secure to keep drinking that expensive champagne and talking big to my competitors. Every hour he stayed away was another hour I had to insulate my clients and prepare the legal net that would eventually tighten around his neck. I contacted my private attorney under the guise of an urgent estate update and began the process of separating our credit lines. I was moving my pawns across the board while he was still celebrating a victory he hadn't actually won. There is a specific kind of power in being the only person in a room who knows the truth. As I sat in the darkness of my home office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The man I thought I was going to marry didn't exist, and the man who had replaced him was about to learn a very expensive lesson in the cost of underestimating me. I wasn't going to just call off a wedding. I was going to perform a clinical extraction of every bit of value he had tried to steal from my life. I wasn't just losing a fiancé. I was watching a thief walk out with my life's work, and I was about to make sure the door locked behind him. When Mark finally returned from his work trip, he walked through our front door with the practiced exhaustion of a man who had just spent 48 hours in a boardroom rather than a luxury cabana. He looked me in the eye and kissed my cheek, his skin still radiating the faint, lingering warmth of the Cabo sun that he thought I couldn't identify. I watched him play the part of the weary provider, and for the first time in 5 years, I marveled at his commitment to the lie. To anyone else, his behavior was seamless, but to a woman who had spent 48 hours auditing his fraud, every gesture was a structural flaw. I didn't pull away. I didn't confront him with the credit card alerts or the photos of him with the Vanguard director. Instead, I poured him a glass of scotch and asked him how the big deal was progressing. I was no longer his fiancé. I was a predator masquerading as his greatest asset. He began to boast, his ego swelling as he described a massive new project he was originating that would change the trajectory of his career. He was talking about my clients, my data, and my hard-earned reputation, but he framed it as his own brilliance. He admitted he was nervous about the final contract structure with his new partners, still keeping the name of the rival firm hidden. He looked at me with that patronizing sparkle in his eyes, the look of a man who believed his wife-to-be was a talented but harmless helper, and he asked for my professional opinion on how to secure the deal's compliance framework. It was the opening I had been waiting for. I leaned in, playing the role of the supportive expert partner to perfection. I told him that in the current regulatory climate, especially with the high-net-worth individuals he was targeting, transparency was his best defense against future litigation. I suggested he include a series of specific highly technical full disclosure and ethical compliance clauses. I explained that these would make him look beyond reproach to the new firm, a sign of extreme professional maturity. In reality, I was guiding his hand to sign his own professional death warrant. These clauses, which I had carefully researched from the American Bar Association's latest guidelines, triggered mandatory independent audits of all origination data and client acquisition history upon the signing of the contract. By including them, Mark was legally consenting to a deep dive investigation into exactly where he got his information. He was so blinded by his own ambition and so certain of my subservience that he didn't even read the fine print. He laughed, toasted to our future, and told me I was the smartest woman he knew. He thought I was helping him build his throne. I was simply ensuring the legs were made of dry rot. The moment he left for his office the next morning to finalize the paperwork, I sat down at my computer. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I sent a single encrypted email to the compliance and ethics department of his current firm. I didn't mention the affair. I didn't mention our relationship. I wrote as a concerned industry stakeholder and provided a clinical factual report regarding the unauthorized export of proprietary real estate data and the misappropriation of corporate funds for a non-business-related trip to Cabo San Lucas. I attached the screenshots of the file transfers from my business drive to his personal account and the resort receipts he had so carelessly left on our shared ledger. Because of the compliance trigger clauses I had convinced him to put in his new contract, his own signature now authorized his current firm to demand a full digital forensic audit. I had turned his brilliant move into a self-winding trap. In the world of high finance and luxury real estate, ethics isn't just a word, it's a legal shield that corporations use to protect their own skin. Once a firm is notified of a data breach involving a competitor, they have no choice but to act immediately to avoid being sued for trade secret theft. The collapse was instantaneous and devastating. Within 48 hours, the corporate machine did exactly what it was designed to do. I was sitting in my office when I saw his car pull into the driveway at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. He didn't look like a corporate climber anymore. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. His firm had revoked his access badges, seized his company laptop, and escorted him from the building. More importantly, the news had traveled to Vanguard Properties through the industry grapevine. In the U.S. corporate world, once you are flagged for an ethics violation regarding proprietary data, you become radioactive. No rival firm, no matter how much they want, your clients will touch a man who brings a potential multi-million-dollar lawsuit in his briefcase. Vanguard rescinded their offer before the sun went down. Mark had lost the job he wanted, and the reputation he had spent a decade building. He sat on our sofa, head in his hands, rambling about bad luck and internal politics. I sat next to him, rubbing his shoulder, listening to him lie, even as his world turned to ash. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. I had watched the system he tried to manipulate turn around and swallow him whole, and I hadn't had to raise my voice once. He thought I was his secret weapon to get ahead, never realizing that a weapon works both ways depending on who is holding the handle. The atmosphere at the private dining room of the Belvedere was thick with the scent of lilies and the hum of two families anticipating a merger. To our parents, this dinner was the final walkthrough before the big day, a celebratory checkpoint for a wedding that had already cost more than most people's homes. I arrived exactly 5 minutes late, wearing a tailored charcoal silk dress that felt like armor. I had spent the afternoon ensuring my hair and makeup were flawless, projecting the image of a woman who was not just successful, but untouchable. Across the table, Mark was a ghost of his former self, though he was putting on a performance that would have rivaled a Broadway lead. He was laughing too loudly and leaning into his father, dropping hints about a bridge loan for a new venture he was supposedly launching. He was desperate, clawing at the air to maintain the facade of the rising star so he could secure a financial lifeline before the news of his professional death became public record. He thought he still had time to spin the narrative to play the victim of corporate restructuring and to use our upcoming marriage as proof of his stability. He didn't realize that I had spent the last hour in the parking lot, taking one final look at the exit folder on my phone, ensuring every line of the ledger was balanced. As the main course was cleared and the champagne was poured for the final toasts, Mark's mother stood up, her eyes misty with the kind of maternal pride that usually makes me smile. She spoke of our perfect union and how Mark had finally found a woman who was his equal in every way. Mark smiled at me, his hand reaching for mine across the white linen cloth, his eyes pleading with me to play along, to be the supportive partner he needed for just one more hour. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I stood up, the clinking of my crystal glass against a silver spoon, cutting through the room like a gavel. The table went quiet, expectant. I looked at our parents, his father, the retired judge, my mother, the school board president, and then I looked directly at Mark. I didn't feel the heat of anger or the sting of tears. I felt the cold, precise clarity of a broker terminating a deal that had gone into default. I began by thanking them for their presence, my voice steady and clear, projecting to the back of the room. Then I pivoted. I announced with the same tone I used to inform a client that their financing has fallen through, that the wedding was officially canceled. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a disaster. I saw the blood drain from Mark's face as he whispered my name, his voice cracking under the weight of his crumbling world. I didn't give him the chance to speak. I spoke in the language of my profession, citing fundamental breaches of contract and unreconcilable integrity gaps that had made the partnership untenable. I didn't mention the other woman or the Cabo son. I spoke of the unauthorized disclosure of proprietary data and the misappropriation of shared capital. I made his betrayal sound like a failed business merger, stripping away the romantic drama to expose the ugly clinical truth of his character. I watched his father's expression shift from confusion to a cold, dawning realization. A judge knows when he is looking at a guilty man, and Mark was currently being tried in the court of his own family's expectations. I was no longer the heartbroken fiancé. I was the liquidator of his reputation. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. I didn't toss it. I placed it firmly in front of Mark. I told the table that inside was a summary of the debts he now owed for the joint expenses he had misappropriated during his work trip, along with a detailed list of the proprietary files he had attempted to sell to Vanguard Properties. I called it his gift of freedom, a final accounting of the thief he had become while we were busy picking out flower arrangements. By making the financial fraud public in front of his father, the man he feared most, I ensured that Mark couldn't lie his way into a bailout. I saw his mother's hand go to her mouth as she realized her son wasn't a victim of corporate politics, but a predator who had been caught. Mark tried to stand his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, his mouth opening to offer a desperate excuse, but I simply turned my back. I had finished my closing statement, and the evidence was indisputable. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking a rhythmic, confident beat against the floor. I didn't look back to see the chaos I was leaving behind, or to see Mark's father picking up that envelope to read the list of his son's crimes. I could feel the eyes of both families on me, paralyzed by the sheer cold elegance of the execution. Mark had asked for my silence, and I had used it to build a cage that he could never escape. He thought he was the architect of his own ascent, never realizing that I was the one who controlled the foundation. As I stepped out into the cool night air and signaled for the valet, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was free, not just from a marriage, but from the burden of protecting a man who was beneath me. I didn't leave because I was heartbroken. I left because I don't sit at tables where respect is no longer on the menu. In the weeks following that dinner, I watched from a distance as the life Mark had so carefully curated began to dissolve with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a sinking ship. In American society, and especially within our high-achieving circles, reputation is the only currency that truly matters. Once the bank of your integrity is bankrupt, no amount of charisma can bail you out. Because I had framed our split not as a romantic tragedy, but as a professional ethics scandal, the ripple effect was devastating for him. Our mutual friends, many of whom were the same high-level executives and power players he had hoped to impress, didn't stage a dramatic intervention. They did something much more effective. They simply stopped including him. Invitations to gallery openings, charity galas, and weekend golf retreats ceased to arrive. His name was quietly omitted from every guest list and professional networking group. He wasn't canceled in the loud public sense that allows for a comeback tour or a sympathetic apology. He was simply erased. He became a ghost in his own city, a man whose presence was now seen as a liability to the very people he had tried so hard to emulate. I saw the reality of his social death in the way people looked away when his name was mentioned in meetings, a brief flicker of discomfort followed by a swift change of subject. While his social capital evaporated, I moved with surgical precision to ensure his financial reckoning was equally absolute. I worked closely with my attorneys to legally separate every joint liability we had ever shared. I provided the banks and credit agencies with the documented evidence of his bad faith and the misappropriation of shared funds I had meticulously gathered in my exit folder. In the U.S., your credit score is the gatekeeper to your lifestyle, and Mark's gatekeeper was about to slam the door because he had been fired for cause and was now under a cloud of an ethics investigation. He had no income to sustain his debts. His credit score plummeted as he defaulted on the high-interest loans he had taken out to maintain his facade. I watched as the symbols of the status he had betrayed me for were stripped away. He was forced to break the lease on his luxury downtown apartment because he no longer met the income or credit requirements. When he tried to secure a car loan to replace the company vehicle he had lost, he was rejected by every major lender. The ultimate indignity came just 2 months after the dinner I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he had been forced to move his remaining belongings back into his parents' house. For a man whose entire identity was built on the ego of a self-made titan living in his childhood bedroom was a fate worse than prison. Mark didn't go quietly, at least not at first. My phone became a digital graveyard of his desperate attempts to rewrite the narrative. Initially, the messages were fueled by a volatile defensive anger. He blamed me for overreacting, accused me of destroying his life over a mistake, and claimed I was being cold-blooded and transactional. I read every word with the same detached curiosity I would use to read a poorly written property listing. I never responded. I didn't block him because blocking him would have required an emotional expenditure I was no longer willing to make. I simply let the messages sit there unread and unacknowledged. Eventually, the anger turned to desperation. The texts changed into long, rambling pleas for mercy, for a second chance, for me to help him clear his name with his former firm. He realized too late that I hadn't just been his fiancé. I had been his system of stability. I was the one who managed the social calendars, the one who vetted his business ideas, and the one whose reputation had acted as a protective shield for his own career. Without me, he was just a mid-level consultant with a history of fraud and no prospects. He began to call, leaving voicemails that started with tears and ended with the heavy, hollow silence of a man who finally understands the magnitude of his loss. He begged me to say something to scream at him to show even a flicker of the passion he thought we once had, but I felt nothing. My indifference was the final verdict on our 5 years together. In my profession, once a deal is dead and the earnest money is lost, you don't call the other party to argue about what went wrong. You move on to the next listing. Mark was a bad property with a cracked foundation and a lien on the title. I had liquidated my interest and moved on. The more he tried to provoke a reaction from me, the more he realized that my silence was the most powerful weapon I possessed. He was used to being the center of attention, the one who could talk his way out of any crisis, but he couldn't negotiate with a void. He was shouting into an empty room, and the echo of his own voice was the only answer he would ever receive. I was thriving. My career was reaching new heights, and my life was more peaceful than it had been in years. I realized that the greatest form of revenge wasn't seeing him suffer. It was him seeing that I was perfectly fine without him. He kept waiting for the storm of my anger to pass, never realizing that the real tragedy was the absolute silence that followed. 6 months after the silence became my permanent response to Mark, my professional world reached a summit I had once thought required a partner to achieve. In the exclusive, tight-knit circles of the American luxury real estate market, news of the dinner at the Belvedere and the subsequent corporate audit had transformed from a scandalous rumor into a testament of my character. My high-net-worth clients, men and women who have spent their lives building empires on the pillars of discretion and trust, didn't see a woman who had been jilted. They saw a woman with ironclad integrity who could handle a catastrophic breach of trust with the same cool, unflappable precision she used to close a multi-million-dollar escrow. My business didn't just survive the fallout, it thrived in a way that felt like a rebirth. I found myself being sought out by developers and private equity titans who wanted the broker of record, who couldn't be intimidated or fooled. I recently closed the largest residential deal of my career, a sprawling coastal estate that broke local records, and as I signed the final commission disbursement, I realized I hadn't thought about Mark's contribution once during the entire 6-month negotiation. I was a powerhouse long before I met him. I had simply been sharing my light with a man who was content to live in the shadows I cast. The market, as it always does, eventually corrected itself. I heard through the industry grapevine that Mark had finally found work, but it wasn't the executive vice presidency he had tried to steal his way into. He was working a mid-level consultancy job in a mid-sized city 3 states away, a place where his name didn't carry the weight of his previous scandals, but also lacked the prestige of the life we had shared. The reports described a man whose fire had gone out, someone who moved through his days with the heavy, muted ambition of a person who knows his best years and biggest opportunities are firmly in the rearview mirror. When I heard the news, I didn't feel the surge of joy or the twinge of sadness I might have expected. Instead, I felt a clinical sense of closure. In the language of my world, Mark was a depreciating asset. I had spotted the structural decay just in time, and I had sold my stake in him at the absolute peak of his perceived value. He was no longer my problem to manage or my reputation to protect. He was a footnote in a very long and successful book, a cautionary tale about the cost of underestimating a partner who knows her own worth. Standing on the balcony of the new penthouse I purchased for myself, a glass-walled sanctuary that looks out over the city I have conquered, I had my final epiphany. For years, I had believed that Mark was the stability in my life, the safe harbor that allowed me to take risks in my career. I thought his corporate climb mirrored my own, and that we were building something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. But as I watched the lights of the city flicker on below me, I realized that the betrayal wasn't a tragedy, it was a profound gift. It was the audit I didn't know I needed. It forced me to look at the ledgers of my life and realize that I had been carrying him for years. I had been the one providing the social capital, the emotional intelligence, and the professional backbone for our power couple image. He hadn't been a partner. He had been a liability disguised as an asset, a drain on my resources that I had mistaken for a shared investment. The moment he asked for my silence, he unknowingly gave me the keys to my own freedom. He thought he was locking me out of his life, never realizing he was actually releasing me from the burden of his mediocrity. I am not strong because of what Mark did to me, and I am certainly not defined by his failure to be a man of integrity. I am strong because I finally stopped pretending he was my equal. I stopped trying to shore up a foundation that was built on sand and decided to build something for myself on solid rock. Looking out at the horizon, I realized that the view is much clearer when you aren't trying to see it through someone else's eyes. My life is no longer a staged home designed to impress a gallery of onlookers. It is a space I have built brick by brick with my own hands and my own rules. I don't look back at the wedding that never was with regret, but with the relief of a woman who walked away from a closing table before signing a contract that would have cost her everything. The silence that Mark once demanded has become my greatest sanctuary, a quiet place where I can finally hear the sound of my own success. I didn't destroy his life. I simply stopped being the foundation for a man who refused to build anything of his own. Thank you for following Patricia's journey of resilience and strategic justice. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by those who fail to see it, and that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is simply walking away from a table where respect is no longer being served. We want to hear from you. Do you think Patricia's clinical and professional approach was the ultimate way to handle a betrayal? Or would you have confronted him sooner? Have you ever had to find the strength to be your own foundation after someone you trusted tried to pull the rug out from under you? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below as your stories of strength inspire this community every day. If you found satisfaction in seeing the truth prevail and want to see more stories of empowerment, sophisticated drama, and the ultimate payoff of integrity, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. By joining us, you ensure that you never miss a masterclass in reclaiming your power. Your support helps us continue bringing these high-stakes narratives to life. Thank you for watching, and remember that your silence is often the loudest message you can send.